Section 6.7 is called the imaginary number, and it is I. Okay? So the definition of I is two things, and these I would highly recommend memorizing both. So I is either going to be equal to the square root of -1, or I squared is going to be equal to -1. So when you go to simplify these, you're going to do the following. So example number 1, if you have the square root of -25, instead of saying no real solution, like you used to say, you're going to simplify this to the square root of -1 times the square root of 25. The square root of -1 is I, and the square root of 25 is 5. And we generally write the coefficient out front. Okay? Example number 2. We're going to rewrite the square root of -50 to the square root of -1 times the square root of 25 times the square root of 2. Square root of -1 is I, square root of 25 is 5, and the square root of 2 can't be simplified, so it stays under the radical. Okay. Example number 3, we have the square root of 16 minus the square root of -49. So we know that the square root of -16 is 4i. Copy the minus sign. And we know the square root of -49 is going to be 7i. These are what we consider like terms. So 4i minus 7i, we're going to combine those to get -3i. Jumping down to number 4. So for example number 4, we have the square root of -4. We simplify that, we're going to get 2i, and then times the square root of -25, which is 5i. Then we can multiply those two together. 2i times 5i is 10i squared. This I squared is -1. So this actually simplifies all the way to -10. Right? Jumping down to number 5. So we have I rad 2 times I rad 3. We're going to multiply the coefficients, so we get I squared. And then we're going to multiply the radicals, so we get the square root of 6. We know that the square root, I squared is -1. So this is the same as -1 times the square root of 6. Now if we could simplify this, we would, but we can't. So we're just going to simplify it to -rad6. Okay. Jumping down to number 6. So just like with radicals, we can't have I in the denominator, okay? So we need to multiply by I over I in order to get rid of the I in the denominator. So if we just multiply straight across, we're going to have 2 times I, which is 2I. And in the denominator, do the same thing, multiply straight across. So 3I times I is 3I squared. And then we know that I squared is -1. So we have 2I over 3 times -1, which is just -3. You can leave the negative sign in the denominator. You can pull it out front and have 2I over 3 negative. And the last one, number 7. So we have the square root of -6y times the square root of -2y. So let's simplify. I know I can pull out an I to get rid of that negative under the radical, so I'm going to have I times the square root of 6y. Same thing here. I can pull out that I, or the -1, make it I times the square root of 2y. Then I can multiply the I times the I to get I squared. And then underneath the radical, 6y times 2y is 12y squared. And 12y squared, I know that has a perfect square factor of 4, so I'm going to pull out a 2. And I have I squared, so that makes it negative 2. Left under the radical, I have a 3. And then the square root of y squared is just y. So the final answer is negative 2y rad 3.